Hello, seventh graders. Hope you're doing well this morning. Um, I wish I could say, how are you doing, and have five responses from you, but I guess recordings don't really work like that, and it's just kind of me talking to a screen. If you could give me some feedback sometimes about what do you like about these lessons, what do you dislike about these lessons, that would be helpful. I hear a little bit of feedback from you on our weekly meetings, but it would be good to just hear on a day-to-day basis uh, how your experience was, because I'd love that. We're going to talk about John Steinbeck today, The Pearl. We turn to chapter 6, which is the final chapter of this book. Now, despite being at the last chapter, we're not going to finish the book today. We're actually going to save half of it for tomorrow, since it's one of the longest chapters. It's about 21 pages, and it would be kind of hard to just expect you to read all of that in one sitting. Especially, just to be honest, there's some slow parts in this chapter. So we're going to have to talk through those together. Let's see. I will talk a little bit now about John Steinbeck as a writer in general, because it really comes out in this chapter what he's trying to do. If you were to assign a genre, meaning a category, to what type of writer John Steinbeck was, your best bet would be describing him as a naturalist. Hmm. Naturalist, I'm guessing you haven't heard that used in literature before as a way to, as a type of genre. It's more than just a writer that talks about nature. That is part of it. And you will notice that even from the parts that we've read of the Pearl, Steinbeck does pick up on a lot of natural things and the way that characters live in nature. Chapter 1, we see them, uh, the book opens with them looking out at the sea, reflecting on his life. And then chapter 2, you have them entering into the waters to go searching for the pearl. Kino and Juan are very in tune with nature. And that's part of what I mean by describing Steinbeck as a naturalist writer. Another way that we could describe him as a naturalist writer is his approach to human behavior. Why do characters act the way they do? Why do humans act the way they do? And what can books say about that? Um, it's something like what you've learned or will learn in Mrs. Studi's class when you discuss the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution meaning that species have come to be the way they are today by a long, long gradual process of evolution, um, according to a principle called survival of the fittest. Have you heard of that term? I hope you have. Survival of the fittest means that how species change depends on how they adapt to their environment. Meaning, in a snowy white biome, a bird that has white feathers will survive more than a bird with black feathers because they blend in with the white surroundings. And so if there's a predator, I don't even know what eats birds, humans. Well, if there was a bigger bird or a predator that was going after this bird, they would see the black bird stick out in the snowy biome more than the bird with white feathers. And so the white feathered bird would pass on its genetics more into the future because they have a higher survival rate, because their genetic qualities help them survive in that particular environment. Now, the certain qualities that get passed down could be a whole many different qualities depending on the certain environment that they're trying to survive in. And that is part of the idea of evolutionary theory. Um, the other part is that this is kind of a process of random chance that we have evolved from. And as you will note, or as you have discussed, there's often a lot of criticism from Christians about the theory of evolution because of their assumptions of where we come from as being a result of random chance and a survival of the fittest, rather than a creative and loving God who determined who we are going to be before we were even born, according to the scriptures. Also in Genesis, part that kind of conflicts with the idea of evolution is that God created humans separate from the animals, that there is animals created on one day, and then on another day we have humans that were created separately in order to rule over the animals, um, care for the animals, uh, and also name the animals, which is really interesting when God brings the animals to Adam to see what he would name them in Genesis 2. Um, so at some point, these two stories about humans are at odds with each other. They conflict. In Steinbeck, I think you almost see a way in which they can converge. Not so much making evolution true or Christianity false or anything like that, but a way that he can see these two in one sense. And what I mean by that is he sees humans as having this ideal in their past, ideal of how they can be at peace in the world and at peace with each other. And then he shows this chaos, this idea of humans at odds with each other and at odds with the ground or the earth. I think there's something similar at in the Genesis story, that while there was once upon a time, this ideal state where God created them, he was in harmony with them, they were working the garden in Eden, and then they were exiled from Eden because of their own selfish sin. And if you follow the stories that come after exile, it's true that human beings act more and more like animals. That is, the original structure in Genesis is reversed, where humans, instead of ruling over the animals, bearing the image of God, they kind of become like the animals in that they are just selfish, just caring for their self or their family, rather than trying to love their neighbor as Jesus tells them to do. That it becomes very stingy and self-interested, and we become kind of just surviving rather than thriving. So, why do I bring all of this up in the first 8 minutes of our video? Well, to understand John Steinbeck's writing, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, while human beings can be great sometimes, oftentimes they act like animals. And he's really interested in showing you that at the end of this book, how they are not so much better than animals. As they enter into this natural environment, the wilderness, they very much become a part of the environment. Now, I'm not saying this is how we should think of humanity, but I am saying that that's part of what John Steinbeck is trying to show. And I think in the scriptures actually show something quite similar, that while we were created in the image of God with potential for greatness and eternal life, that there's also this portrait of humanity as very much fallen and almost acting like the animals around us, and that we need to trust in God, our Savior, through the person of Jesus Christ, in order to bring us back to that exalted state of what we lost in Eden. Enough preaching from me. Let's do some reading, shall we? So, chapter 6, where does this chapter even begin? Page 68, please open up your books and we will begin talking about the pearl. Last time we left off in a very catastrophic event. Catastrophic meaning horribly uh, disastrous, in that his house burned down, his straw hut, and not only did his house burn down, but Kino killed someone. What did I just say about animals? Yeah, that's what animals do. They're violent without much remorse. Kino, in the same sense, he says, well, I'm sure he was after me for my pearl. So I was acting out of self-defense, and that's okay. Uh, right? Juana says, sure, maybe it's okay, but are the judges going to care if you think it's okay? Because all that we see now is a dead person right next to your house, and doesn't look so good, Kino. So I don't know how this is going to work out. So they decide to both first stay at Juan Tomas's house, and then they're going to depart in the dark. Everything's done in the dark now. The murder was done in the dark, and now they're departing to the city in the dark. Because what happens in the dark, according to the Bible? Sin happens in the dark. But let's read on, shall we? The wind blew fierce and strong, and it pelted them with bits of sticks, sand, and little rocks. Juana and Kino gathered their clothing tighter about them and covered their noses and went out into the world. The sky was brushed clean by the wind, and the stars were cold in a black sky. The two walked carefully, and they avoided the center of the town, where some sleeper in a doorway might see them pass. For the town closed itself in against the night, and anyone who moved about in the darkness would be noticeable. Kino threaded his way around the edge of the city and turned north, north by the stars, and found the rutted sandy road and through the brushy and rutted sandy led through the brushy country towards Loreto, where the miraculous Virgin has her station. Miraculous Virgin refers to Mary, mother of Jesus. Very common image in Catholic places, and the region of Mexico, which was run by Spaniards at this time, colonized by Spain, was very much Catholic. So they would have images of Mary everywhere. This is where the statue is in Loreto that they're headed to find a deal, some business where they could sell their pearl. Kino could feel the blown sand against his ankles, and he was glad, for he knew there would be no tracks. The wind is blowing their tracks and messing up the sand so that nobody can follow them. That's the hope. The little light from the stars made out for him the narrow road through the brushy country, and Kino could hear the pad of Juana's feet behind him. He went quickly and quietly, and Juana trotted behind him to keep up. Some ancient thing stirred in Kino. Through his fear of dark and the devils that haunt the night, there came a rush of exhilaration. Some animal thing was moving in him, so that he was cautious and wary and dangerous. Some ancient thing out of the past of his people was alive in him. The wind was at his back, and the stars guided him. The wind cried and whisked in the brush, and the family went on monotonously. Monotonously means one tone, the same pace, without much change, hour after hour. They passed no one and saw no one. At last, to their right, the waning moon arose, and when it came up the wind died down and the land was still. Now they could see the little road ahead of them, deep cut with sand-drifted wheel tracks. With the wind gone there would be footprints, but they were a good distance from the town, and perhaps their tracks might be noticed. Kino walked carefully in the wheel rut, and Juana followed his path. So, wheel rut is like the trail that this wagon has left behind. Since the wind is no longer erasing their footprints, they're going to stick to this rut as their way of blending in. All night they walked and never changed their pace. Once Coyotito awakened, and Juana shifted him in front of her and soothed him until he went to sleep again. And the evils of the night that were about them. The coyotes cried and laughed in the brush, and the owls screeched and hissed over their heads. And once some large animal lumbered away, crackling in undergrowth as it went, and Kino gripped the handle of the big working knife and took a sense of protection from it. Nature is a bit hostile in this paragraph, noting all of the screeches of the owls and the coyotes. Yikes, have you ever heard a coyote? Look it up. Or don't, it's a bit freaky. The music of the pearl was triumphant in Kino's head, and the quiet melody was of the family underlay it. and they wove themselves into the soft padding of sandaled feet in the dust. All night they walked, and in the first dawn Kino searched the roadside for a covert to lie in during the day. He found his place near to the road, a little clearing where deer might have lain, and it was curtained thickly with dry brittle trees that lined the road. And when Juana had seated herself and had settled to nurse the baby, Kino went back to the road. He broke a branch and carefully swept the footprints where they had turned from the roadway. And then, in the first light, he heard the creak of a wagon, and he crouched beside the road and watched a heavy two-wheeled cart go by, drawn by slouching oxen. And when it had passed out of sight, he went back to the roadway and looked at the rut and found that the footprints were gone. And again he swept out his traces and went back to Juana. She gave him the soft corn cakes Apollonia had packed for them, Apollonia being the wife of Juan Tomas. But Kino sat on the ground and stared at the earth in front of him. He watched the ants moving, a little column of them near to his foot, and he put his foot in their path. Then the column climbed over his instep, and continued on its way, and Kino left his foot there and watched them move over it. You might be wondering why that was written, and you might be really bored by that mention of ants. Um, I can't give you an exact interpretation of why he mentions the ants. However, he may be feeling small and insignificant, like an ant. Ants are described in the Psalms as well, as a way for a human expressing their own uncertainty and smallness in a dangerous world. So that could be what he's thinking about. I don't know. The sun arose hotly. They were not near the gulf now, and the air was dry and hot, so that the brush cricked with heat, and a good resinous smell came from it. And when Juana awakened, when the sun was high, Kino told her things she knew already. Beware of that kind of tree there, he said, pointing. Do not touch it, for if you do, and then touch your eyes, it will blind you. And beware of the tree that bleeds. See that one over there? For if you break it, the red blood will flow from it, and it is evil luck. And she nodded and smiled a little at him, for she knew these things. Steinbeck mentions twice that Juana knows a little bit about nature herself, and that she doesn't need it explained to her by Kino. Kino is kind of a know-it-all sometimes, but maybe he just doesn't know if she knows, which says something about their relationship. Will they follow us? She asked. Do you think they will try to find us? They will try, said Kino. Whoever finds us will take the pearl. Oh, they will try. And Juana said, perhaps the dealers were right, and the pearl has no value. Perhaps this has all been an illusion. Kino reached into his clothes and brought out the pearl. He let the sun play on it until it burned in his eyes. No, he said. They would not have tried to steal it if it had been valueless. What do you think? Do you agree? We've kind of assumed that this pearl is really expensive, right? It's described as being massive, and Kino even says it's worth 50,000 pesos when they offer him 1,000 pesos. But are we supposed to trust Kino that he knows exactly what a pearl is worth? Has he ever even talked to a pearl merchant that wasn't around his own town? Does he have this kind of encyclopedia of what certain pearl sizes are worth that we're just supposed to get along with? Honestly, we don't know what it's worth. But like Kino's doing, we can assume that it has some value because people have been trying to steal it ever since he found it. And Steinbeck tells us close up that these merchants are all working for the same guy and they can't be trusted. So we probably shouldn't trust their evaluation either. But we're left in the dark as to what this pearl is actually worth in the end. So let's continue reading. Do you know who attacked you? Was it the dealers? I do not know, he said. I didn't see them. He looked into his pearl to find his vision. When we sell it at last, I will have a rifle, he said. And he looked into the shining surface for his rifle, but he saw only a hurtled, dark body on the ground, with shining blood dripping from its throat. And he said quickly, we will be married in a great church. And in the pearl he saw Juana with her beaten face, crawling home through the night. Our son must learn to read, he said frantically. But there in the pearl was Coyotito's face, thick and feverish from the medicine. He's seeing his dreams in the pearl, at least he wants to see them, but he's only reminded of the damage that it's already done to his family. And Kino thrust the pearl back into his clothing, and the music of the pearl had become sinister. That means evil, malicious, dangerous, in his ears, and it was interwoven with the music of evil. The hot sun beat on the earth so that Kino and Juana moved into the lacy shade of the bush, and small gray birds scampered on the ground in the shade. In the heat of the day, Kino relaxed and covered his eyes with his hat and wrapped his blanket about his face to keep the flies off, and he slept. But Juana did not sleep. She sat quiet as a stone, and her face was quiet. Her mouth was still swollen where Kino had struck her, and big flies buzzed around the cut on her chin, but she sat still as a sentinel. And when Coyotito awakened, she placed him on the ground in front of her and watched him wave his arms and kick his feet, and he smiled and gurgled at her until she smiled too. She picked up a little twig from the ground and tickled him, and she gave him water from the gourd she carried in her bundle. Kino stirred in a dream, and he cried out in a guttural voice, and his hand moved in symbolic fighting. And then he moaned and sat up suddenly, his eyes wide and his nostrils flaring. He listened and heard only the cricking heat that the hiss of distance. What is it? Juan asked. Hush, he said. You are dreaming. Perhaps. But he was restless, and when she gave him a corn cake from her store, he paused in his chewing to listen. He was uneasy and nervous. He glanced over his shoulder. He lifted the big knife and felt its edge. When Coyotito gurgled on the ground, Kino said, keep him quiet. Um, Notice that we see him reference his knife again in this passage. He's done that twice already in this chapter. One was the one before this was when he entered the wilderness and he started hearing all the animal noises. So when he feels endangered like this, he always goes back to that tool, the knife that he has been putting his faith in to keep him safe throughout the journey. Pardon the interruption there. I had to go take care of something, but I am back and we are still on page 72. We left off with um, Kino trying to keep his kid quiet. When Coyotito gurgled on the ground, Kino said, keep him quiet. What's the matter? Juan asked. I don't know. He listened again, an animal light in his eyes. It's like the second or third time he's been described as an animal or having animal-like qualities. This goes back to our lecture at the beginning about how Steinbeck's a naturalist writer trying to show how humans at their worst act like animals. He stood up then silently and crouched low. He threaded his way through the brush toward the road. But he did not step into the road. He crept into the cover of a thorny tree and peered out along the way he had come. And then he saw them moving along. His body stiffened and he drew down his head and peeked out from under a fallen branch. In the distance he could see 3 figures, 2 on foot and 1 on horseback. But he knew what they were, and a chill of fear went through him. Even in the distance he could see the 2 on foot moving slowly along, bent low to the ground. Here one would pause and look at the earth, while the other joined him. They were trackers. The trackers. They could follow the trail of a bighorn sheep in the stone mountains. They were as sensitive as hounds. Here he and Juana might have stepped out of the wheel rut, and these people from the inland, these hunters, could follow, could read a broken straw or a little tumbled pile of dust. Behind them on a horse was a dark man, his nose covered with a blanket, and across his saddle a rifle gleamed in the sun. Kino lay as rigid as the tree limb. He barely breathed, and his eyes went to the place where he had swept out the track. Even the sweeping might be a message to the trackers. He knew these inland hunters. In a country where there was little game, they managed to live because of their ability to hunt, and they were hunting him. They scuttled over the ground like animals and found a sign and crouched over it while the horsemen waited. Freaky! So this guy with his two assistants are the trackers. They are expert huntsmen, meaning they can detect any sort of track, any trace left behind. And as we've seen, Kino and Wana are getting more traceable because the wind is dying down. And they are on to them. And so not only Kino is expecting an encounter now, and he's starting to think of what am I going to have to do to get away? If we were in this situation today and you were just out in the woods and you see a trail from someone, you probably wouldn't expect that they were hunting you, right? That seems a little weird to us. But in this situation, he has the most valuable thing in the city. He's alone in the dark, and he doesn't want to come into contact with anybody. He is infamous, meaning people know who he is and what he has, and he is a wanted man. Okay, that's why this is suspenseful. All right, where were we? He knew these inland hunters. They were hunting for him. They scuttled the ground like animals and found a sign and crouched over it while the horsemen waited. The trackers whined a little, like excited dogs on a warming trail. Kino slowly drew his big knife to his hand and made it ready. He knew what he must do. If the trackers found the swept place, he must leap for the horseman, kill him quickly, and take the rifle. That was his only chance in the world. Steinbeck's pointing out that this is Kino's thoughts, not necessarily his, because when Kino gets scared, he goes into this fight or flight situation. Fight or flight meaning he's either going to attack or run away, and there's no other option in Kino's mind. This is what happens when you panic. It's not something that happens when you are deliberately thinking something through. This is a scared, fearful man who's acting on adrenaline, and assumes that the only way out is to kill someone in his trail, just like he did last chapter. See how dangerous this thinking is? He doesn't think about, oh, maybe we could negotiate with this person. Maybe we could solve this in a more humane way. No, it's fight or flight for Kino in this moment. We're at the 28-minute mark, which means I want to start wrapping this up. I like to keep them below a half an hour. But we read 74, we read through page 74, and I need you to get to page 80. So I want you to read at least through 79 so that you are at page 80 for the conclusion of our discussion, which will happen tomorrow. What an exciting book. At the end there, before I move on, you'll notice that the hunters, too, are described in animal-like ways in the way that Kino describes them, or the narrator describes them. So you're supposed to catch not only is Kino acting in this sort of frantic creature mindset, but that could be described as in the same way that these trackers are portrayed. So that seems to be the dominant level 2 think interpretation that I have for you today, which is that there's this idea that humans can become like animals at their worst. And that also applies to my level 3, which is the connect questions. How can you connect this to either another text or your own life? This is what we talked about at the beginning, how Genesis 3 paints a similar light, where humans are instructed by God to and designed by God to be above the animals, using their minds rather than just their instincts, and also instructed to love those that they don't naturally love. They're supposed to love their neighbor. And who is your neighbor? Everyone can be your neighbor. You're instructed to be this source of love that is not understood simply by protecting your own family like the animals do, but it's something beyond that, that transcends that. Okay, enough of the talk about animals and humans and the differences and similarities, but keep thinking about that for next time because it'll come back into play. Your only homework is to finish the reading and then finish the daily question. And please keep up on your Membeing. Don't forget that's a weekly thing, and we are going to keep that in action throughout the rest of our online learning. We are almost towards the end of the school year, so as we meet the home stretch here, don't slack off on your homework because you got to finish strong at everything you do. It's best to finish strong. So you can do it. Hang in there. It's beautiful outside, and make sure you are enjoying the last month or so of your time at Chapel Hill for this year. Don't let any coronavirus get you down in your delight of learning. Okay, I'll talk to you next time.